Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company too. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. So much for Labor's $1.2 million new homes target. As new data out today shows building approvals are the worst in a decade. And the fast that is the PM's Help to Buy housing scheme if you live in one of our capital cities. The integrity of the Queensland Premier Steven Miles is in tatters as he's forced to issue a rare apology for misleading the Parliament. I tell you, in the good old days he would have resigned. He says, of course, it was a lapse of his memory, but very few are buying that excuse. Plus, a big win for Donald Trump with the US Supreme Court ruling unanimously that he can and should remain on the ballot, paving the way for a 2020 repeat of a Trump-Biden showdown. For many Democrats, that'd be their worst nightmare as Biden gets shakier in the polls by the day. And Dutton gears up for an election battle, reshuffling his shadow cabinet and laying out more detail on their nuclear policy. It's still got a way to go, but this is an opposition prepared to take the fight up to the government.
They're proposing rolling out 28,000 kilometres of new poles and wires. Their program is at a cost of $1.2 to $1.5 trillion, all of which is going to be passed on in the form of higher bills to families and businesses who just can't afford it. So I think there is a rational debate to be had here.
Well, if Peter Dutton wanted a fight over nuclear energy, it looks like he's going to get it. And that's no bad thing for an opposition. You certainly can't beat an incumbent by just agreeing with them, as the Victorian Liberal Party needs to learn and fast. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said that nuclear energy was fine for others, but not for Australia. And today, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, really unleashed on the coalition.
Peter Dutton is more interested in cheap and divisive politics than he is interested in cheap and reliable electricity. And we see that in this nuclear fantasy that he is engaged in. You know, his proposal will cost hundreds of billions of dollars, take decades to build. I think most Australians recognise that our future is renewable, and that's where our efforts and our attention must lie.
Look, I can't speak for the opposition leader, but I reckon you can drive a truck through the government's position. First, there's the lack of logic in saying that nuclear power tied up at a dock in a nuclear-powered submarine is okay, but it's almost evil if it ever comes on land. Second, if renewables are so cheap, how come the more renewables we get into our system, the more expensive our power has become? Now, the obvious answer is that renewables are only cheap when the wind blows and the sun shines, yet we need power 24/7 if we're to remain a first-world economy. And batteries and pumped hydro and gas, well, they all cost a bomb. And that's if they work as promised. And on batteries and pumped hydro, well, the jury is still out. Third, as the world's third largest uranium exporter, how could we be squandering our natural advantage, as Chalmers wants to claim, if we also use our own uranium here in Australia? Fourth, if nuclear really is a fantasy, how come nuclear provides 70% of the power in France, 20% of the power in Britain and America, and is already in use in 33 other countries? A further 15 too are also looking at nuclear as the only proven way of delivering 24/7 power that's almost 100% emissions free. Now, the hysteria coming from Labor suggests that they know Dutton's onto something and they're trying to bluff him out of prosecuting the case. Just like they knew he was onto something when he took the position he did on The Voice, and Labor then mounted hysterical attacks, calling him a wrecker and worse, until the votes came in. And he was right, on the side of the majority of Australians, and the Prime Minister was not. Now, on nuclear, if there's no commercial case for it, then why have a ban? There's no need for any prohibition. And if there is a commercial case for nuclear, well, let's get the bans removed ASAP and then see what market options might emerge. Now, certainly across the board, the public now think nuclear power should be on the table. Back in 2015, the public were evenly split on nuclear power. 40 for it, 40 against it, the rest undecided. By 2022, an IPA poll found that 53% of us supported the proposition that Australia should build nuclear power plants to supply electricity and reduce carbon emissions. Back then, just 23% of us were against it. And in the latest news poll out last month, we had 55% of Australians supporting the building of small modular reactors and just 31% against. As Peter Dutton pointed out today, it was the late Bob Hawke who first championed nuclear power in this country, saying in 2016 that nuclear power, he said, would be a win for the environment and an essential part of attacking global warming. Now, he's not alone. There are plenty of other union leaders, especially those unions that depend on heavy industry. Well, they're supporting nuclear power as well.
If you look at it right now, I've been pragmatic about talking about nuclear energy before. I remain open and pragmatic to it, and hopefully it can create some good A2U jobs as well.
When we're looking for a long-term energy fix in this country, all options should be on the table.
And Australian living legend, the electronics guru Dick Smith, well, he chimed in today saying that we could get nuclear power within 6 years and that Labor's opposition to it was, and I quote, emotional and irrational. Said Dick Smith, there was simply no way you could run a country 100% on renewables. Now, support for at least having the option of nuclear power on the table is not going to be enough on its own to win the election for the coalition. But it would be a strong start to the coalition's positive policy agenda. And as a demonstration that it knows being a small target won't win against a first-term government. Also today, there was a minor reshuffle of the opposition frontbench. And here's a move I want you to note tonight. The replacement of the now retired Senator Maurice Payne as Shadow Cabinet Secretary with the super smart and driven James Patterson. Now, as you know, I reckon he's one to watch. Now, I was previously the former Shadow Cabinet Secretary under 3 opposition leaders. So I know how much the role is, in critical terms, important for the opposition. It's about creating policy, holding ministers and the staffing machine to account to get the work done and costed and out to a deadline. So I say this move from Dutton as demonstration that the coalition are well and truly up for the policy fight. That there will be, at the next election, a real difference, I think, between Labor and the Liberals. No longer Labor light under Dutton, finally something we hope that Conservatives will have to vote for. And perhaps too a new home for traditional working class Labor types, the ones that modern Labor has abandoned as they've moved further to the left and more woke. All right, let's get the headlines now from Canberra. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. The Coalition is preparing to make a detailed pitch to voters to embrace nuclear energy.
You can't turn off the existing system, which is what Mr Albanese is doing at the moment, and just hoping that the battery technology is going to improve overnight.
The policy, which will be taken to Shadow Cabinet next month, will also nominate potential sites for reactors.
We're only interested in looking at sites where you've got an end-of-life coal-fired generation asset.
But Labor says nuclear doesn't make financial sense.
Peter Dutton is more interested in cheap and divisive politics than he is interested in cheap and reliable electricity.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton has reshuffled his shadow frontbench in a wider-than-expected shake-up.
They're important changes because they reflect the skill and the depth of capacity and capability that we have within our ranks.
Peter Dutton elevating his close ally Luke Howarth to the roles of Assistant Treasury and Financial Services. Melissa McIntosh will take charge of energy affordability as well as Shadow Minister for Western Sydney. Senator James Patterson will add the position of Shadow Cabinet Secretary to his responsibilities in Home Affairs. The reshuffle provides a taste of Peter Dutton's political priorities in the lead-up to the next election, targeting outer suburban seats, the economy and energy policy. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating has called for ASIO boss Mike Burgess to be dismissed. He accused the top spy boss of trying to undermine the Albanese government's efforts to stabilise relations with China. He said he should have been sacked after the last federal election. It comes after the ASIO chief last week revealed a former Australian politician had corroborated with the Foreign Intelligence Service. He also took aim at Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who he's accused of being out of step with Southeast Asia.
Well, with Dunkley out of the way, the next by-election is for Scott Morrison's old Sydney seat of Cook, and the Liberals last night pre-selected Simon Kennedy as their candidate. And for both major parties, the focus now is on the lead-up to the federal budget and the fight to frame the narrative. Is this a government that gets it, that's listening and acting on the concerns of Middle Australia, or is it a government that's out of touch? Joining me now for his analysis, as he does every Tuesday, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Well, Andrew, great to have your company. Good to see you on Saturday night. I was thinking over the coverage on Sunday and in the wash-up in the print media. One thing that struck me, and you said this on Saturday night, is how dangerous it would be for Labor, regardless of the margin, that they were out there, that they were cocky. I think the word you said, that they would become unbearable after this win. Now, we saw warnings today from the unions and old-time party elders saying, out of the weekend's result, you know, they got through, yes. They had a swing to them, yes. That's a signal to get back to basics, not just talk about cost of living, but actually do something tangible about it. I think this is a challenge for Labor. Let's see how they go. But are you getting a sense that they're humble in this victory, or are they cocky as you feared?
Oh, look, people were saying to me, you won't see any hubris from this government, but behind the scenes you might. And I think that was the point I made to you off camera, that I've seen this in many governments of many persuasions, that they get a few wins up and, a fair bit of hubris comes into play. So they've got to guard against that, because there's a long way to go before the next election, and they did get a swing against them.
Are they focused on the budget? Are they focused enough on delivering practical outcomes, you know, stuff that people can see and feel and touch on the ground in terms of relief?
Well, some mixed messages on that, aren't there? I mean, Jim Chalmers seems to be telling journalists, well, there will be some cost of living relief, but we won't be going over the top. Inflation's tempering. We'll get GDP figures tomorrow. I would have thought it's probably time to flick the switch a little bit. I know he wants a surplus, but I think you've got to give some relief, especially in the energy bill space. We had a health insurance rise today, which was very convenient, wasn't it? It's like 2 days after by-election, they finally waved that through. So that sucks up a lot of your tax cut. They've still got a lot of issues. That tax cut thing obviously worked. They had a reasonably good result, I think. They could have lost after all. They could have copped a bigger swing. But they need to show that they are doing things about cost of living, that they're working hard towards that, and hope that their economic policies are sound enough that we can see some rate cuts by the end of the year.
Olivia just played some material there from the opposition leader Peter Dutton, and I mentioned the fact that he shuffled around his front bench today. Minor in terms of movements. He replaced Stuart Robert. He's now long gone. He's brought in Luke Howarth, another Queenslander, to move into that outer ministry portfolio. But I think the most critical play here was the replacement of Maurice Payne as Shadow Cabinet Secretary with, I think, the very impressive James Patterson. I made the point back in the Nelson, Turnbull, Abbott era, I did the job of the Shadow Cabinet Secretary, as well as the Chief of Staff and other things. But, I mean, why this role is so important in opposition is it's the sort of the clearinghouse of all the policy. It drives the shadow ministers to actually get their documents done, get them in, costed, work them through the system, get the backbench support for it, etc. Now, getting rid of Payne, who was in the departure lounge, putting someone ambitious like Patterson in the job, I reckon that says he's serious.
Yeah, I think we're so far inside the beltway here, I can't even see the cars on the road, Peter. But I know what you mean. It's a machinery change. And machinery is important for what you do with politics. And James Patterson's worked hard, and by promoting him, he's showing the other shadows, if you work hard, you'll get rewards. But ultimately, he hasn't made any big moves at the top end. And, he has the right to do that. He doesn't want to upset people too much, I suspect. And he's brought someone in like Andrew Bragg, who could probably be a troublemaker after Dunkley, and he's brought in Melissa Matheson, who faces a pre-selection challenge, as if to say to the New South Wales Liberal Party, she's won Lindsay a couple of times, for goodness sake, don't be stupid, pre-select her. So all of that's pretty interesting in the mix, but yeah, I don't think they're talking about this around the kitchen tables or the dining tables tonight.
No, but if you don't get your machinery right, if you don't get your right team on the field, if you're not doing the policy work, we get to election day and people say, geez, the coalition should have done more, or the costings were buggered up, or, you know, they missed an opportunity in a particular policy area. So, you know, you can't fatten that pig on market day, as John Howard used to say. And if they want to start writing policies for the next election, I mean, that started yesterday, if they're serious. So I think putting him in there says they're serious.
Well, I think it has.
On someone like the PM.
Peter, I think they have several policies ready to go. My understanding is they have the housing policy ready to go. They're obviously, as we revealed today, quite a long way along the way in terms of the nuclear policy. So they have been doing the work, is my understanding. There's an immigration policy ready to go. They're on the way, at least, to presenting some decent alternatives at the next election.
I think you're a bit more optimistic than I am, but we'll see what happens when I catch up with a few people. Does this put pressure on the Prime Minister, though? I mean, he's got Andrew Giles, who sits out there as an obvious candidate who should be moved on. Do you think he's going to have the ticket to do that before the budget?
I don't think it'll be happening before the budget. I think it'll be later in the year. And that will come from retirements, etc. Linda Burney, I don't know if Mark Dreyfus wants to go. That's when I expect that to occur. He probably thinks the way he's going, I mean, he just won the by-election, that he can leave Giles there for the time being. The problem they're going to have is if one of these detainees commits a serious criminal offence, and it's going to be a big problem. So, you know, I'd be, I think I've said this on your program before, I'd be working pretty hard to at least get a couple of applications up so that you're seen to be doing something about that issue.
Well, I think if you're the opposition, you keep Giles there as long as you possibly can. You don't want the Prime Minister to move him on. Hey, you had some detail out today, exclusive detail about the opposition's plans in relation to nuclear. A bit more of a sense of how many nuclear power stations we're talking about, where they might be. What can you tell us?
Well, this is very ambitious, isn't it? They're going to identify 5 or 6 sites that could have nuclear reactors. And they're going to say, we're going to lift the moratorium. It has to get through shadow cabinet, of course, but it seems Peter Dutton's pretty hell-bent on doing it. And 5 or 6 sites, New South Wales, Victoria and beyond. And I think they're all going to be former coal-fired power sites, or ones that have been or are being decommissioned. So you can think about Liddell and Bayswater in the Hunter Valley, and then it's the Latrobe Valley, isn't it? Your Lorne and Loy is just a few options for them. And perhaps Collie in Western Australia, who knows? So, look, this is pretty courageous stuff, isn't it? I mean, I know the polling shows it's popular amongst young people, but I think you said something in your intro which is very true. They want a fight. They want to have a fight over an issue. Now, they think this transmission idea, thousands and thousands of kilometres of power poles going out to support renewables, isn't the right course, isn't going to fix the problem, and is unachievable in terms of the greenhouse targets. So they're daring Anthony Albanese and saying, well, we can do it through nuclear. Albanese will launch a scare campaign off the back of that. We suddenly have a very interesting contest coming up for the next election after what last time was a pretty small target election on both sides, it has to be said. But the last time someone took an ambitious
agenda... And all those Labor right
agenda,
unions too.
Yeah, so, yeah, well, that's true. AWU will support it. But the last time someone took an ambitious agenda to an election didn't end so well. So we'll see.
Just really quickly, I mean, Simon Kennedy named last night as the Lib candidate for Cook. Being pretty cagey about whether Labor will even run in Cook. What do you think?
Seem pretty cagey about what? Sorry, I just had someone in my ear then. Seem pretty cagey about...
Cagey about running in Cook. Labor running in Cook.
Oh, they're not going to run. I don't think they'll run. I was told last week it was highly unlikely. I don't think they'll waste the resources, Peter.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Catch you next week, Andrew Clennell. Let's go to Queensland now with the newly installed Premier Steven Miles. He's in hot water over allegations he misled Parliament by denying he sent a text message to a factional colleague. The now growing questions about his integrity and his government's links to lobbyists, with calls for the Integrity Commissioner to investigate. For more, I'm joined now by Sky News Brisbane Bureau Chief Adam Walters. Adam, thank you. He apologised to the Parliament today. We all saw that, but will it be enough?
Peter, it's called a credibility crisis for Steven Miles. Just a month after he laughed off questions from Sky News about Queensland's youth crime crisis, he's now being accused of lying to the Parliament of the state he leads. This scandal started brewing last October when the member for the Queensland seat of Palmerston, Ali King, was caught asking constituents to send applications via her electoral email address for jobs at a new satellite hospital. Now, the LNP said this had a strong whiff of corruption about it and a jobs for votes scenario. Now, last month, the LNP's member for Burleigh, Michael Hart, was asking the Premier to confirm he did not send an SMS to Ms King on October 11. The Premier replied swiftly, simply by saying, "I can." It turns out he misled Parliament with an image of a text message emerging to show the then Deputy Premier was urging Ms King to, quote, apologise for her error of judgment. Now, today, the Premier finally came clean. This is what he had to say.
I understood the question related to compliance with right to information requirements and answered to the best of my recollection. However, last night it was brought to my attention a photograph taken in the chamber while the Legislative Assembly was sitting. I wish to update the House and advise that I, as the member for Murrumba, did text the member for Palmerston during question time, which was the subject of the member's question. The text message was from some time prior and I did not recall it at the time. I therefore wish to correct the record and apologise to the House for the error.
Peter, the Speaker of the House, then killed the microphone of Michael Hart as he stood to reject the Premier's apology.
Well, I'm interested too in the brouhaha over the Integrity Commissioner, because when pushed over the allegations in relation to lobbying, inappropriate lobbying, she says, and this is the watchdog, that she doesn't have the powers to investigate claims of secret lobbying. So what's the point of having a watchdog if the watchdog can't hold an investigation?
Peter, indeed, it seems like the Queensland Integrity Commissioner has conceded there are no teeth in the tiger. Linda Waugh has been in the job since 2022 and has admitted to a parliamentary committee she can do nothing to act on her concerns about the influence of undeclared lobbying. The number of registered lobbyists in Queensland has jumped by 48%, Peter, to 337 in February this year. Now, the LNP wants the Integrity Commissioner to closely examine reported links between former Labor Cabinet Minister Katie Jones and a lobbying firm set up last December as Steven Miles was landing the Premier's job. Now, the Australian newspaper has revealed that Ms Jones was engaged as a specialist consultant as the firm expanded its Queensland operation to register 8 new clients within 24 hours of the factional deal to make sure that Mr Miles would replace Anastasia Palaszczuk.
Well, good work in your reporting, Adam. A lot of this would not be out there in the public domain if it wasn't for you. Thank you for your time tonight. I tell you, Queensland, but you're happy you've got an election in the offing. After the break, for all the talk about housing, it looks like a massive Labor fail, record high immigration, but the worst new home approvals in over a decade. Plus, private health insurance premiums now set to rise, of course, announced 2 days after the Dunkley by-election. Ross Greenwood after the break, and what this all means for you and the economy. Welcome back. Still to come, the madness on Melbourne's Westgate this morning. Climate activists holding everyone up here for ASEAN noise and colour and movement, I suspect. We're going to get serious about cracking down on this lot. But first, let's go to that push for more housing. Exposed as nothing but a bit of a farce. New building approvals are down. The rental market is tighter than ever at 0.7% in terms of vacancies. And there's a big fat lie at the heart of the Prime Minister's so-called Help to Buy scheme. The expert who's going to make sense of it all is our Sky News business editor, Ross Greenwood, who joins me now. So let's start with those new housing numbers, Ross. This is the data of housing approvals. The forecast for January was a 4% boost. In reality, we only got a 1% boost, meaning that over the past 12-month period, we've had just 160,000 new dwellings approved. Now, that's a long way off the 240,000 that must be built annually if the government's got any chance of meeting that 1.2 million target. What's been the reaction of industry to this data?
Well, the reaction is the same as it's always been, and that is that the target, ambitious though it might be, is almost unachievable. And the reason, as we've talked about before, is if you're a builder or a developer, I spent some time with a few of them today, as a matter of fact, they tell you quite frankly, if you can't make money or you've got a significant risk of making money when you're going into a building project, you just simply don't build. And so that's the key. And then what you've got in many of the states, but particularly in Victoria, is additional taxes on property owners that simply take the incentive away for anybody to want to build. So you talk about around the nation as to what's taking place to try and achieve this target. You know, Victoria should be building around a third of those homes, the 240,000 homes, which is the target of the Albanese government over the next 5 years. So he'd have to build about 80,000 homes a year. Now, the reality is right now it's building around 51,000 homes. So you can see how far short of the target it is. The long-term average, strangely, over 10 years is about 64,000 homes a year. So even that is well below the target. So the reality is right now, when you've suddenly had property owners in Victoria having an extra $4.7 billion snipped out of them by the Treasurer Tim Pallas over the next 4 years, and at the same time you've even got business having $3.9 billion in additional payroll tax taken from them, there is no surprise right now that Victorian home values are rising at the slowest pace of any capital or rather of any capital city or indeed any state right now. And the reason for it is because the incentive to build, the profit motive, is simply not there, and that's causing problems for the Albanese government that wants to grow Australia's population and to build more housing.
You squeeze, though, at both ends of the spectrum in places like Victoria, because you've got this windfall tax that came in last year where the developers have to pay the difference between what they bought the land and what they then sell it on, so they subdivide it. Right. And that's almost at 50%. So who's going to develop? They're going to land bank, which is why there's so many low housing approvals out of Victoria. At the other end, the mum and dad sort of investor says, gee, I'm sick of the playing field changing all the time. I'm hearing the speculation that they're going to come after my negative gearing. I can't afford this land tax on top of everything else my family's copying at the moment. I'm going to sell the house. And stories again today of all of these people that have long held rental properties saying to the agent, just get rid of it. I'm going to put the money in the share market. I can't afford this. So then you've got that market, constricting, because people that are buying them, maybe living in them, you haven't got as much supply available. And you've got then this massive migration continuing that's putting pressure on the only homes we've got left in the market. So any wonder you've got record low vacancy rates and you've got a lot of stress out there when people can't find homes.
And the second aspect of this is, guess what happens with all of that? You actually suddenly get rental inflation coming through at a significant rate. And so as a result, what you've got is inflationary forces inside the Australian economy. So that is not inflation that's been imported from overseas, as the government likes to tell us quite often. This is homegrown inflation. And nothing is being done about this in regards to try and give incentive to build new homes. Remember that Anthony Albanese, at the start of his big target of 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years, effectively said, well, we're going to put up $3 billion of cash. And this was to the states. Guess who gobbled up a lot of that? Victoria, to try and say we'll open up to try and build more housing. But the problem is, right on the ground, as you point out, people don't want to build because A, the risks are too great, and the incentive is too little for them to be able to do so. And you've still got all the issues that are historic, and not just in Victoria, but right around Australia, of the costs being simply too great in regards to trying to build new projects right now, and even trying to get labour to build those projects is risky. That's the reason why, if you look around your capital cities right now, you don't see very many cranes. The developments have pretty much stopped, and that is not good for Australia long term.
All right, we'll get to health insurance in a moment, but before we leave housing, this Help to Buy scheme, the Prime Minister crows about it. There's plenty of money on the table, 300 odd million from the taxpayer. But you get in the detail today and you find out that only 4% of Sydney properties even qualify under this scheme. Most capital cities don't get much out of the scheme. Well, that's where most people live. So I don't know how good this scheme even is.
Well, is it practical? That's the big question. So in other words, is it a little bit of grandstanding? And let's be honest, every government will do something like this, come up with a grand scheme. But once you start to get into the practicalities, as you point out, it's actually hard to qualify. So here it is, yearly income of $90,000 or less for individuals. What bank is going to lend to you at that? Annual income of $120,000 or less in capital cities? That is almost impossible to buy a house with. So that's it. You must live in the purchased home, no problems there. You can't own any other property in Australia or overseas, no problems there. Able to finance the remainder of the purchase, there's your problem. Because right now the banks are going to look at you and say you don't have the income to be able to justify this home, because there is simply not enough skin in the game for the bank to make it worth your while to be able to, if you lose a job, be able to cope with that. And that's something, again, that the government has got to deal with.
All right, let's get into private health insurance. The cynical me says, gee, surprise, surprise. They announced this increase 3 days or 2 days after the Dunkley by-election. That's out there right now. It's 3% or just over 3%. It's less than inflation, so the government says that's terrific. But it's the biggest increase we've had since 2019. It's about $500 extra a year for families. So that's real money on top of everything else. There goes your stage 3 tax cut. And I fear, this is my big worry, having done health policy in the past, Ross, is that people are getting to the point where they're saying, oh, I've got to pay my mortgage, everything else has got to go. I'm now looking at whether I can keep my private health insurance. And of course, when they drop out of private health insurance, they come back into the public system and it's already struggling.
So it's a really big circular thing. So remember, any insurance industry is a big pool. And the reality is that the people who drop out first are those people who are feeling the mortgage pain. They're the younger people. But the younger people claim less than the older people. And so what happens is you add more risk to the pool if the younger people start to drop out. You're seeing here some of the increases and just what it's going to go up. By the way, those average increases, as we're seeing here, is just the average. It's not if you're in the top cover, the gold cover, you're going to get whacked with a whole bunch more. So that's something else to keep in the back of your mind. But as I say, this is, remember, a numbers game. Now, the increases right now are not as great as what they were going back from about 2002 to 2008, when around, a 40% increase over 5 years happened. But the real issue that happened then could potentially happen now. People start to drop out. It increases the risk in the pool. If the pool has a greater risk, the premiums keep going up, and therefore more people drop out. And that is a circular game you simply don't want any health insurance company to have to face, because that makes it even more affordable for people, or less affordable for people into the future as well.
Spot on in that explanation. I think everyone can follow that at home, and that's the real worry. It's the worry about the pool. Ross Greenwood, thanks as always.
Okay.
How good is he? I tell you what, we love him on Sky, don't we? All right, after the break, Australians are struggling. Yes, our budget's drowning in debt. So tell me then why the Prime Minister found $2 billion today to dole out to all these countries in our region to get their emissions down, or whether they spend it on emissions reduction or not. Plus, that shocking news about a 13-year-old arrested and charged with the sexual assault of a female jogger. Now, under Labor's planned changes to the law in future, a 13-year-old will get off scot-free. Welcome back. We're going to get the latest out of the US. Super Tuesday happening now in the US. Of course, we'll get the results Wednesday morning. We'll run it here tomorrow night. And that big Supreme Court decision for Donald Trump, a big win, puts him back on the ballot across the country. Let's get into some other local issues. Former Liberal MP Nicole Flint And the new Shadow Assistant Treasurer for the Opposition, Luke Howarth, joins me tonight. Well, congratulations to you, Luke. Great to have your company as always, Nicole. Help me understand, Luke Howarth, you're the numbers man now. Why on earth, given we're drowning in debt, are we putting $2 billion into a whole lot of green schemes and emissions projects across Southeast Asia? That was announced today by the Prime Minister.
Well, it just seems extraordinary, Peter, and great to be with you and Nicole, but it seems extraordinary at a time when Australians are struggling with the cost of living. We're seeing homelessness rates go through the roof under the Albanese Labor government, that they're investing $2 billion of probably products made in China in Southeast Asia. I mean, that money could be spent here. It could be investors to make life for Australians much easier, but this is what they have. They have this globalist view. And they're obsessed with renewable energy. And as I said before, most of this stuff, wind farms, solar panels, it's all made in China. So most Australians would say, look, what are you doing? We didn't vote for that.
Oh, spot on. And we know down in Victoria, Nicole, just the other day, the Liberal opposition supported the government on a 95% by 2035 renewables target. A lot of speculation that John Pizzuto is on the ropes, the Liberal leader in Victoria, of course. He lost his two most senior staff on Saturday or Sunday. We're not sure. They certainly resigned over the weekend. The Sharks are circling. They're all talking about who is going to replace him, not who might replace him. He says, though, he's a fighter. He's not going anywhere. He's battling on. What do you think his chances are of being there at the next election?
Absolutely zero, Peter. And if only the leader of the Victorian opposition, the Liberal Party, had spent all of his time fighting the Labor Party rather than fighting Moira Deeming, who has incredible grassroots support from across the Liberal Party, across Australia. If only he had spent time fighting Labor rather than fighting Moira and fighting his own people, we would be in a very different position right now.
Spot on, Nicole Flint. I think he's not long for this political world. Let's stay in Victoria because the crime down there is shocking, and it's been shocking for a long time. But I mean, these are stories today that I just cannot believe. We've got the footage out of a 14-year-old girl with autism beaten in broad daylight in Altona, and then the footage was sent around to humiliate her. And we also learned that police have charged a 13-year-old boy. This isn't a separate incident, but charged a 13-year-old boy with the sexual assault and stalking of a female jogger. Now, Luke, one of the debates we're having in Victoria, you're having it in Queensland too, is lifting the age of criminal responsibility. And if Labor gets its changes up in Victoria, this 13-year-old boy charged with sexual assault couldn't be touched because they want to lift this number to the age of 14.
And Peter, we know that the Federal Attorney General Dreyfus in the Albanese government is all for lifting the age of responsibility as well. That's Labor, weak on crime, weak on consequences. And when you don't have consequences for offenders, this is the sort of behaviour that happens and plays out right across the country. But for years now, you know, in Victoria and in Queensland, we've had predominantly Labor-led governments that have weakened laws. We've seen up here, you know, the former Attorney General, Yvette D'Arth, is about to bail, weaken laws up here as well. And as a result, we've seen crime rates go through the roof. And so the same's happening in Victoria there as well. And those poor victims, that woman that was attacked by this young perpetrator, and that poor woman, that poor young girl that was attacked who has a disability as well, that's not the sort of Australia that we want to be living in. These people need to be held accountable for their actions, and we're not seeing that under Labor governments in both Victoria and Queensland.
Well, up in Queensland, Nicole, there's a push on from the unions to give everyone there under union awards reproductive leave and what's called preventative health leave. This is for stuff like IVF, vasectomies, recovering from something like breast cancer or prostate cancer. Sorry, not recovering from cancer, just time off to go and have your screening done. Menstruation's there. I didn't know that was a disability, but anyway, menopause as well. What staggers me with all of this, I mean, if you're running a small business, we've already got people who have got 10 days sick leave. I thought that's what this was for. carers leave, domestic violence leave, volunteer leave, parental leave, annual leave, long service leave. I mean, does anyone ever go to work anymore?
It doesn't seem that we will have any workforce left at this rate, Peter, and it's just, come on, this is just ridiculous. Businesses just won't be able to function. And it's not just small business and family business here, it's also big business who employ lots of people as well. But, you know, on things like whether it's the reproductive leave or menopause leave, honestly, the actual focus should be coming up with better treatments for these sorts of issues rather than just giving everyone more leave and encouraging them to be sick and take time off of work. We've actually got to start solving the problems for people, especially for women.
Hey, Luke, what's the story with a bloke that's on the dole? He's created a union for people on the dole, yes, if you can believe it, and a charity as well. And the charity is an official government-sanctioned charity. We're told there's about $130,000 in the bank. It's not giving donations to people in need. I mean, most of it seems to be in a bit of a merry-go-round coming back to this bloke, or certainly expensed by the union. But how does he get charitable status? And if he's on the dole and we can see that he's not working, he's not getting out there to try and find work, throw the book at him.
Well, it's just a complete joke, really, Peter. I mean, the Treasurer needs to look at who's receiving tax deductibility status and who isn't. I know that, for example, Scripture Union Australia, who look after many chaplains in schools, that are doing great work on the ground helping kids with their mental health, had their tax deductibility stripped by the Albanese Labor government last budget, and yet you've got unions like this that are receiving tax deductibility status. A guy that hasn't worked for 8 years has been offered multiple jobs and is out there saying, you know, our public welfare system and safety net in Australia isn't as good as what it could be. The reality is when you have people advocating like this, it impacts the Australians that really need it, those people with disability, those people that are on pensions. And so any minister that gives this guy any time, or any advisor that gives him time of day, I believe he's travelled to Canberra many times, no one should be seeing this guy, and it should be called out for the joke that it is.
See why he's on the front bench now. Luke, thank you for your time. Luke Howarth there, promoted today, of course, by the opposition leader Peter Dutton. Nicole Flint, great to have your company as always. All right, after the break, the huge news out of the UK, the return of George Galloway to the Parliament. I'll explain why he's so dangerous. Plus, my panel will break down Super Tuesday and that big decision about Donald Trump from the US Supreme Court. All right, let's head now to the UK, where the controversial Workers' Party of Britain leader George Galloway has been sworn in as an MP again following his victory in the Rochdale by-election last week. The British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was very alarmed at his election and slammed his views on Hezbollah and the war in Gaza. Here's Galloway speaking with Sky UK reporter following his win.
I oppose Israel's occupation of Lebanon, and I respect the right of people in occupied territory to resist their occupier. And I've done so since Hezbollah was formed.
So for more on this and why it matters, political editor at The Express Online, David Maddox. David, explain the Galloway history here and why he's so dangerous, particularly given the tinderbox on anti-Semitism and pro-Hamas, in his case pro-Hezbollah London, that is what we're watching now.
Well, hi, Peter. Yeah, I mean, last time I was on your show, I was talking to you about how the streets of London in particular have been taken over by Islamic extremism. You know, George Galloway is a kind of symptom of all that. He's a hard left, far left politician who was kicked out of Labour for opposing the Iraq War back in the noughties. He's you know, allied himself with some really dangerous Islamist groups, although, you know, he would deny that, but you know, he certainly sympathised, it appears, with terrorist groups. Just the other week, the Prime Minister described him as anti-Semitic in the chamber, and he's won in this Rochdale by-election with, you know, what was a really poisonous, venomous campaign, full of intimidation. He was literally going around with henchmen. People were feeling threatened by him. And, he's won a big vote. And, there's suspicions about the vote. There's been calls for review of postal voting, with concerns about voter harvesting. It's a bad mess. It's a real bad mess.
And Rochdale, his seat is relevant here. I mean, it's got its own history. But what does his election say about the current climate right now in Britain?
Well, what we're seeing is a hugely divided society, and a lot of people will put this down to kind of open borders immigration for the last 20 years, really. I was talking to a very senior minister who's over the weekend, who's not particularly an anti-immigration minister. He's not on the right of the Conservative Party, but he was saying that this is a symptom of 20 years of really too much open immigration, too much, sitting back and allowing extremism to fester. And they've realised that they've got to do something about it. Rochdale is one of these kind of former mill towns in the north of England that, has a large Muslim population, but also very underinvested, a lot of unhappiness. It's an absolute perfect place for somebody like Galloway to land and and to stir things up, and that's what's happened here.
And that's what's happened. I've got to leave it there, David, but thank you for that insight because it's so relevant and a warning here in Australia. David Mannix there from the UK. Let's bring in my panel. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, former Labor MP Michael Danby. I'll come back to that in a moment, Kosha, but I really want to get your take on this big US Supreme Court win for Donald Trump.
Great to be with you, Peter. Pretty monumental ruling, certainly legally, because it was a 9-0 unanimous majority decision, which doesn't happen very often. I checked in the last decade, that's happened only about 30% of the time in terms of all cases that come across the Supreme Court's desk. So that has big implications not only legally, but politically, because it really claps back on any narratives that were out there about why Trump should be disqualified as a candidate, given that even the 3 Liberal justices ruled in this way. The reason for it ultimately comes down to the idea that no state can unilaterally decide for the whole nation, and there is a pathway for disqualifying people seeking federal office, which requires Congress passing a statute, a federal prosecutor calling a grand jury that indicts that person, getting a unanimous jury conviction, and then a judgment held by a federal judge upheld on appeal. None of that happened, and so this, I think, was certainly a boost for the Trump campaign, but more importantly for the country, because it's restoring rule of law and constitutional clarity.
Michael Danby, George Galloway in the UK, I mean, he's an ex-Labor MP, ex-Labor member. I mean, there's a real cancer on the left, an anti-Semitic cancer, we talk about that, but a pro-Islamist, not pro-Muslim, but pro-Islamist cancer. We're seeing it play out more and more across Britain, and the concern here in the Labor Party, particularly in the branches in New South Wales, it's arrived in Australia.
George is a loudmouth grifter. They call them wide boys in the UK, loud and shallow. He's on Russia Today and the Iran's press TV. He's doing what you would expect of a person with those views. But his role is to, before the British election, is to hive off the Muslim vote in those depressed parts of Britain that you were talking about before, and force the Labor Party. He's targeting Angela Rayner, who's the deputy leader in one seat, targeting them so they'll adopt far-left positions on Iran, on Hezbollah and Hamas. Peter, he is a hypocrite. He supports Putin in Russia. So the children killed in Odessa yesterday by Iranian Shahad drones are okay by George, but it's useful to attack the Labor Party and to have his own vengeance on the political system in the UK by mobilising Muslim votes over Gaza in all those depressed parts of Britain.
All right, Kosha, Super Tuesday, what are we looking for?
Well, I think in the wake of that Supreme Court ruling, which confirms obviously Trump will be on the ballot in the general election, now people can turn their eye to how he's going to perform on that ballot. And I think Super Tuesday, no surprise, he's going to dominate Nikki Haley, who's remaining there. On the Democrat side, it's interesting as well how much leakage Biden might see, or third-party candidates like RFK Jr. or Cornel West, where they are appearing on ballots. What's going to happen with them might actually be an important story, even if not shifting the overall dynamic. But I don't think we're going to see any major surprises.
Just quickly, Michael, it's called Super Tuesday because it's 15 states all in one day. But any insights you can give us?
I don't think Nikki Haley, unfortunately, has a chance, but I'm glad she's staying in the race to give an alternative to President Trump. I think President Biden's continuing open border is the thing that mainly goes in favour of Trump, and that's why I think he'll win the nomination and ultimately win the election.
All right, we'll leave it there. Stay safe, Michael Danby there in Kyiv. Thank you for your time. We'll be here tomorrow night covering all of the stuff coming out. Oh, Munich. There you go. We had the strap there wrong. Munich. Well, that's a little bit safer. That's a little bit safer. Tomorrow night we'll capture Super Tuesday here on Sky. We'll have all the analysis for you. I'll be back tomorrow night at 6, of course. Here, straight away, is Andrew Bolt.